Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to episode 11 of the Umana Yana podcast. I'm your host, Josh Jaipal, and today we have a very special guest joining us today, a gentleman who goes by the name of Nathan. And Nathan and I had the good fortune of actually having our paths cross recently. School that I did out there in Markham, Ontario, Canada. And he started a very interesting initiative where he actually has built this network for the former graduated alumni to actually connect. He engages, with the people who have graduated, since the school first opened, to really engage with them and understand what's going on in their world, what they've learned, all the different takeaways, all that kind of stuff. So it was a very interesting podcast that I got to do with Nathan. And I said, you know what? I got to return the favor. I got to get him into the seat that I was in so we could have a very interesting and highly intentional conversation. I've really been drawn to Nathan because, he's really about community building at the core, and he's a recent graduate. So he's going to be able to really give us a lot of that insight around, what the next generation is really seeing when it comes to their mental health, how they champion it, the different experiences that they go through. So there he is. Nathan, welcome.
Hi, Josh. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for taking the time to have me this afternoon.
Absolutely. I was just sharing with all of our everyone who's tuned in a little bit about you and how our paths crossed.
Yeah.
So I'm incredibly excited for our conversation today, man. Thank you for accepting my invitation to, switch roles. You were just in the podcast host seat not too long ago, and that was a really cool experience. So thank you for that.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, something that I like to do before we get going in our conversation is I like to let our guests introduce themselves the way they see fit. And the reason for that is, I could pull up your LinkedIn resume, for example, and I could ramble off 20 things, but you know what? You might not necessarily identify or lead with those things when you're trying to introduce yourself. So I really want to flip that over to you and take it away, Nathan. Let the people know who you are.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks. So as you said, I'm Nathan Chin. As you said, we met through our high school alumni network that I founded. We both went to the same high school here in Markham, Ontario. A little bit more about me. After graduating from that high school, I went to Ivey Business School at Western University. I just finished there, class of 2025. And I know you want to talk a lot about mental health. So, some things I'm passionate about dealing with, concussions throughout my career, especially in sports, and kind of recognizing the idea of, the stigma behind it has been something I've worked towards. I'm passionate, I'm open book, and I'm excited to be here and talk all things health with you.
Awesome, man. And, the vulnerability is so key. I find that especially as men, one of the things that we can do to really model healthy, mindful behavior moving forward, for those around us, be that men or women, is really for us to lean into that vulnerability in sharing those things that, people might not have, eyes on per se, but it's kind of going on in the background, right? Mm-hmm. We kind of get conditioned and really trained well on how to mask these things, and kind of just make it seem that all is well, at all times. So, opening up spaces for us to have these types of conversations is super important. So, as I was thinking of a title for our episode today, what was really coming to me is managing mental health while we're trying to make it.
Right.
And the reason I say that is because, I know you're a recent graduate, and I can imagine, I remember what it was like to go through uni and, that grind and whatnot and come out on the other side of it. So, I really just thought how interesting it would be to get your insight on how that journey's been for you as you were going through it, now that you find yourself on the other side of it, and now as you prepare to, move away from those sort of societal conditions of like, okay, go to school, do your thing, now make a life for yourself. So I thought that would be a really interesting way for us to frame this conversation today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. It's a big milestone, I guess, that, I think everyone kind of looks towards, and it's the first time in my life where I don't really necessarily have like a planned path for you. Like, I was thinking like in September, it's not like I'm going to be moving back into school and getting ready for school. So yeah, I think it's really important to understand that, there are people out there who have done it, and I think it's important to lean on other people and not try to, do it alone. I think that's been a big part of my journey, is recognizing the idea of community, which we talked about on the episode that we did a while back, leaning into that vulnerability, like you mentioned, just recognizing that people are willing to help, generally speaking. It's just about making that connection that can be difficult, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, for sure. With that being said, I would love for us to actually jump into our conversation. And the way I like to start off the conversation is actually asking, Nathan, what's one thing that you feel grateful for today?
One thing I feel, I'm actually heading on vacation tomorrow, flying out. I just came back last week from a Caribbean cruise, and tomorrow I'm flying to Europe. to go to Norway. So I'm looking forward to spending time with some family.
Nice, living the dream, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
Awesome. Well, with June now a little bit behind us, right? That was Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, and I know you and I connected, around this topic. And so, I'm curious, how did you find yourself participating in the awareness promotion during the month of June, and how do you carry that with you outside of that month?
Yeah, that's always been, a cause close to my heart. I don't know if we want to touch on it now, but dealing with these concussions, like I mentioned, has been kind of a life-changing event in my life, and it's always something I keep close to my heart. And I posted like a podcast with you and a podcast with other mental health advocates, and I think it's really important to me, especially when I shared that page, was to talk about the things that are hard to talk about, and share the ideas that people don't necessarily have the power to talk about. That makes sense. Just being an advocate for it, being open and vocal about it, is something that's super important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so concussions. So with concussions being a big part of your story, was that through sports that you attained those concussions, or how did that all come
Yeah.
about?
Yeah. So I grew up playing competitive hockey. I played AAA from the ages of 2 to 5. And yeah, I think the two biggest influences on my life growing up were hockey culture and like an East Asian culture, Chinese culture. And I think growing up, especially in a family of all boys, I think, like you said, vulnerability isn't always talked about. There's a certain expectation that you handle things with strength and a fortitude at all costs, right? I think in those cultures, you're often told like, hey, there's a million people, or not a million, but there's people behind you who would gladly take your spot if you complain, as I'll call it. And growing up, that was kind of the idea that I had. So when it came to dealing with concussions, I had a really bad concussion when I was 10. And I was never allowed to play hockey again. And that was kind of like the turning point, I would say, where, at first I saw it as, a problem, but eventually it evolved into more of a challenge and almost like a calling to want to advocate for it. And had a few concussions since, but I think each time it kind of reminds me that, there's more work to be done when it comes to invisible injuries and stigma, especially when it comes to men.
I think that's amazing how you alchemize that experience,
Yeah.
especially having endured those concussions so young in your playing career,
Yeah.
right? Like I know we both resonate because we both played hockey,
Yeah.
right? And we might not be the typical faces that our community is expecting to see on the ice, right? So, being men, we really draw a lot of our identity, I find, from our performance on a field. Right? How well can we play this sport? How well can we really outwit the others that we're against, kind of thing. So, I'm curious for you. I know you were young when it happened, but do you find that played on your mental health and in terms of how you're going to be able to show up in the world? Because now, a sport that you loved is a little bit off the table for you.
Yeah.
Like, how did that impact you?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I didn't necessarily even realize at the time, and people around me might have a hard time understanding, is that like when it comes to invisible injuries, there's like you're not wearing a cast, or you're not walking on crutches. It's invisible, right? Quite literally, and I think it really impacts like your physical, your mental, your emotional, your social, like all those things, and that was really hard to kind of convey to other people. Because like yes, like you can't play hockey anymore, and people are kind of like, oh, what's the big deal? But as a 10-year-old, I was probably on the ice 6-7 times a week, and you're with these guys day in, day out. So that's like the social piece and the emotional piece as well. And at the same time, like I think concussion recovery has come a long way since, which can be like a whole other episode. Even though I'm not a medical expert, but even dealing with concussions over time and hearing what doctors have to say, like back then, this was like 13 years ago, like the common advice was to just sit in a dark room. Whereas now it's a little bit more like active recovery. So that definitely had a toll on me. And yeah, sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Just how it's really impacted you, because sports is often, we're often conditioned to, as males especially, to have sports be a big part of our identity and form of expression. So, how did your limited ability to now play after those concussions impact you and your sense of identity from that point on?
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, being on the ice 6-7 times a week, I didn't have time to do much else at that point. And after that, it was, like I said, it became like a problem. But eventually over time, the main impetus for it, for, you know, coming out of it, I'll kind of say there's a bit of a trigger warning here, but a few like months and years after the concussion, there was multiple NHL players who committed suicide after dealing with concussions.
Right.
And that was really kind of like an awakening for me, right? To kind of realize that, hey, like this is like a serious thing that's not being talked about enough.
Yeah.
And there's people literally losing their lives to it. Some of the guys who you think are the strongest people in the world are losing their lives to these invisible injuries. And at that point, it kind of became more of a challenge than a problem, right? That was kind of the shift in my mindset when that happened. Unfortunately, you know, people lost their lives, but I will say that I gained a deeper sense of understanding from those tragic events, right? And luckily, I was introduced to volleyball by my parents, and they met playing volleyball, so they kind of wanted me to go into that, and I was able to find success in it. Even if it wasn't my first choice, coming from such an intense sport like hockey, I kind of thought, you know, volleyball is just, you know, something you do at the beach.
Yeah.
It's kind of soft, it's kind of slow.
Yeah.
But eventually I learned to love it. And that kind of became my way to, you know, get over hockey. And, you know, since I've stopped playing volleyball, I've had the chance to really reflect even deeper on hockey. I never wanted, you know, volleyball to kind of be like a Band-Aid. But in a lot of ways, it helped me, you know, build an identity beyond hockey. So I was super grateful for volleyball.
Yeah. No, that's
Yeah.
great. And you know, I'm curious, what did you like, what really shocked you, I guess, as you've been in the space of, you know, doing more awareness around these invisible injuries that people have and whatnot? You know, what's come to light for you, and how do you think you've really made impact in that space, having, you know, embraced doing this work yourself as well?
I can't say I've made, you know, that much of an impact. You know, I always want to do more. There's no kind of end and say, hey, I've made an impact. There's always, you know, more work to be done. Especially as, you know, I get older and I meet more people, get more resources, things like that. So I won't say that I've made a huge impact, but you know, fundraising is always important to me, especially on this page. And just like keeping talking about this and meeting people, you know, like you who have you know, great deal of experiences and expertise in the space. But yeah, the one thing that's kind of shocked me, it's I would say just that, like, you know, someone can be, you know, all put together on the outside, and you talk to people and you have a deeper conversation with them, and you kind of learn that, you know, like their life hasn't been easy, or, you know, they're struggling with things, right? There's no like typical look, you know, of someone who's like dealing with things. Everyone handles it differently. And like I said, you'll meet some of the people, like like I said, when it came to like the hockey thing, you think these are like the strongest guys out there, like physically and mentally, and you realize that, like, hey, there's I don't want to call it a problem, but there's something going on, and you know, everyone can be affected by it, and people just handle it differently.
That's fine.
Yeah.
You know, and I resonate with that because I
Yeah.
myself, having played so many different sports, you know, I've
Yeah.
had injuries that I've almost tried to deny. Like I
Yeah.
try to tell myself, no, Josh, you're not hurt. You know,
Hmm.
you're okay. You know, because I just don't want to experience that feeling of like, oh, will I have to give this up? Am I
Yeah.
really saying my body failed me in this moment? You know, like all of those things kind of run through my mind. So I know what it's like to really override, you know, when my body's trying to signal to me, hey, you know, maybe take a look at this. You know, you took a hit over here.
Yeah.
Let's get that checked out, kind of thing. So, you know, like what kind of, you know, coming from this space and having personally experienced concussions for yourself, I know they're a major issue because having played
Yeah.
hockey, I know guys were having concussions, you know, left, right, and center. And, you know, as we get into the more intense leagues and stuff, you know, the hits are harder, the
Yeah.
pucks are getting slapped harder, right? So, you know, your increased likelihood and all of that. So, what can you share for those who are tuning into our conversation? Maybe some things that they might be sort of downplaying, but that's actually maybe something that's a sign indicating that they might be in that sort of concussion protocol sort of area. You know, do you have
Right.
anything like that that you can share with us?
Yeah, you know, I'm not a, you know, expert on the field, but you know, I think, like, really, like, if you, for me, it was like, you know, you can't sleep, you can't eat, you know, things like that. If it's interfering with your daily life, you know, that's when you kind of have to say, hey, maybe this, you know, isn't worth it. And you
Mhm.
kind of have to have those conversations, like, and another thing too is like, when people around you and people, your loved ones, you know, they might start to notice that you're maybe not, you know, the same person that you were before.
Yeah.
You know, that can be a big warning sign as well. And yeah, like you said, it's really hard to kind of admit that, hey, like my body's not keeping up with this. But I guess like even if you, let's just say, even if you did make it all the way to the pros, you know, your career is lasting at most maybe 20 years.
Yeah.
So I think for me, like, you know, not that the pros were necessarily in the picture, but for me, it was just like, hey, like you have a lot longer life to live than you just playing sports, right? And I think especially when your loved ones start to notice that you might not be all there, then I think that's when you really have to have a deep conversation with yourself.
Yeah. Great advice, man. Thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate
Yeah.
it. Shifting gears a little bit,
Yeah.
in talking about our mental health and our sense of, showing up and being, the man we want to be and all that kind of stuff, right? We obviously go through life and we have our ups and downs. We have our successes. We have, those super high points. We go through those low points as well. And, I'm curious, what have you noticed when it comes to the men who have been around you, be that, friends, maybe relatives, just in your ecosystem generally, right? The people you
Mm-hmm.
talk to. When it comes to mental health in men, do you find how do you find our attitudes are towards it, and when it comes to bringing the topic up and doing something with it, what do you notice happens?
Yeah, it's difficult. Like I saad, I've grown up with two brothers, right? And we, yeah, rarely, if ever, talk about it, right? Especially in my culture. And, even with my parents, sometimes it was difficult to kind of say, hey, I'm, struggling with this after hockey. And I think for a lot of people, I think the most difficult thing is to like, they might not even know how to handle it either, right? So,
Right.
I don't blame anyone for that, right? And I think it's been more so talked about lately. Even the last like 5, 10 years, it's more talked about, right? But yeah, I think, men tend to say, I'm just going to go to the gym, or I'm going to go for a drive and listen to some music, right? There's very few, I think you brought it up on our episode. There's very few words that men use to describe how they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's either I'm good, I'm mad. Like there's very few words, right? And it's, hey, like, how much are you bench pressing? Hey, how's your stock investments doing? But it's rarely ever like, hey, how you like actually doing, right? And it's almost
Mm-hmm.
weird for guys to like talk about it. Whereas it's more normalized for women to talk about it. And, I was doing a bit of research, and I think men are like 30% more likely to commit suicide. Or
Mm-hmm.
sorry, three times? Something
Three
like,
times, I
yeah,
believe.
yeah,
Yeah, I
three
think I saw
times.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
3 times more likely. So that was eye-opening. But, when I reflect on all my experiences, I don't want to say it makes sense, but it really has to do with the way we think and we communicate with each other as men.
for sure. And
Yeah.
like that's always an alarming
Yeah.
stat for me. Like, around every year, you see that stat updated, but it's not like it's ever going down.
Mm-hmm.
And something that we've connected on as well is, with the Caribbean culture, right?
Yeah.
With my family being from Guyana,
Yeah.
we have a very alarming stat in Guyana that at one point we actually had the second highest rate of male suicide in the
Mm-hmm.
world.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I find it as something that we can't just sort of, wait and be like, all right, I hope the next guy up, really, really opens up this conversation and gets it going. I find that we have to just be super intentional, and we have to be willing to have those, what might come across initially as awkward or really uneasy conversation, especially with the people we love, right? Like with our
Right.
family and whatnot. And,
Yeah.
I've noticed that there's a huge learning curve, right? Because we're almost in this place now where we have the privilege of some time to check in with what am I feeling right now,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's not something that they necessarily were able to have for themselves or felt safe enough to take, right? So I find that, in trying to express, hey, I'm struggling with this, I not only have to know how to communicate what I'm feeling, I have to also set the stage and help them to feel safe so they're not feeling it's like a judgment on them, much like you
Yeah.
said, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
not here to hold anybody and say you did a
Yeah.
crap job or something.
Yeah.
But, I noticed that that's something that we need to do. So I'm curious, like, for you, do you find yourself being that sort of change within your own ecosystem and family as well? Or like, how are your attitudes and approach to
Yeah.
it going with cycle breaking?
That's a tough question. Like you said, there's been a long lineage of, this kind of like silence around it, right? Especially in certain cultures. And um, I, I, I try not to look at myself as, someone doing the cycle breaking. I try to, you know, measure it in terms of like how I'm helping other people and not just like, oh, I'm, the first person to raise it. Like I think I'm more so looking, down the line and saying, hey, like I want to see progress in the future. I
Yeah.
think that's more important to me than saying like, hey, I was the first person to bring this up. I don't know if that answers your question, but I haven't really thought about that, to be honest.
Okay. No
Yeah,
worries.
yeah,
Yeah, no,
it's
and like for example, like for me within my family, right? Like,
mhm,
something that I would do, I realize that they don't necessarily like the super like beeline to the point kind of
yeah,
thing. You kind of
mhm,
gotta massage it and dance around it a bit. So it would
mhm,
be something like showing up with one of the books that I read that really impacted me. Or for
mhm,
example, I stopped drinking. So anytime I'd be around them, even if they're making that choice for themselves, they see me holding water. So
right,
it's like modeling it versus being too in their face. Like, I found that that's been kind of an effective approach to at least introduce different elements into the ecosystem for us to maybe converse about, hopefully,
right, hmm,
but not saying that my sole purpose in life is say to change how you guys do this, but more to be an influence on that ecosystem.
yeah,
Um,
exactly, yeah,
yeah,
hmm,
yeah, for sure, man. So I'm curious on your take about how shame, ideas around strength, and the values that we have and the values we place on the identity of the male really impact mental health and how we have approached it, the strategies we take around it, or maybe the way we totally ignore it. What are your thoughts
yeah.
around that?
Yeah, I think, throughout this episode, we've talked a lot about, how males are expected to behave, especially, whether it be the Asian culture, Caribbean culture, hockey culture, or any sport for that matter. You're expected to handle things with a great deal of strength, and place a lot of team goals over your own. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it can, manifest when, like you said, you start playing injured and do a great deal of harm to yourself, for the sake of the team. Like for example, like you hear about these NHL players, they play through like broken ribs, broken thumbs, broken fingers, like throughout the playoffs for that, team goal, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it's hard. I think there's a certain like code, that you don't bow out, when the team is in a rough spot. Like you said, I think that can bring a great deal of shame to people, um, or at least like internally a perceived sense of shame,
Yeah.
when you kind of like give up. I don't want to call it giving up, but when you say, hey, like, I need to rest, I'm not at full health, I don't want to call that giving up, but when you say that and you kind of speak about your own health and your individual goals, it can kind of bring shame in a lot of those cultures, like I mentioned, unfortunately.
Yeah.
um so yeah, I think that was something that I realized dealing with this concussion, was that, sometimes you need to speak up and just, I don't know, it's really hard when I think back to it. Like, I wanted to be there for my teammates, and that also can bring, a deal of shame, just feeling like
Yeah.
you weren't there for your teammates when they needed it.
For sure.
I can't comment on how it might be for girls, but I know, for men, it's quite difficult to, um, like I said, kind of other people, would say, hey, I'm going to take your spot.
Yeah.
If you get injured, I'm going to take your spot, that kind of thing, right? So,
For sure.
there's definitely, I'm not sure what the, solution is, but I've definitely experienced it before.
Yeah, because like
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of like the NBA and whatnot, and
Hmm.
so I'm not like what was apparent throughout the playoffs and this season essentially is that they had more, what was it, torn ACLs, I think it
Yeah.
was,
Hmm.
than ever in a single
Yeah.
season. I think it was like eight.
Hmm.
And I saw a lot of elements that you mentioned, at play, right? There was a lot of criticism of these players who are playing through injury, right?
Yeah.
Even though they're choosing to play through injury, they're still being criticized for not
Yeah.
playing at 100% when they're playing through injury, right?
Hmm.
And then, we have someone like Tyrese Halliburton, who in game 7 of the final, it literally snaps at that point,
Hmm.
right? And he was
Yeah.
just trying to be there for his team. So we do see this, right?
Yeah.
And, I think that the more we actually talk about it and, if we actually think about the long game, right, we'll actually
Yeah.
be able to see some of these choices to maybe rest or recover or maybe just take a little bit of a break,
Yeah.
right? We might see
Hmm.
these actually as being as mindful, intentional action, right? That are really about making sure that we stay and live in our power for longer than instead of
Hmm.
getting sidelined, right?
Yeah.
That kind of like, to me, that's really ties into our connection, like with our intuition, right? And
Hmm.
our discernment, right? Like, are we actually in tune with what our body's trying to communicate to us, right?
Hmm.
And in a world where we're so badly trying to pick up on all the external stimuli to make sure that we're not missing out on anything, I think the thing we miss out most on is actually the internal system that's trying to tell us so much
Yeah.
and actually sets the parameters for how much we can interact with those external stimuli.
Right.
right?
Yeah. Like at the end of the day, like your pain, signals are there for an evolutionary reason.
Right?
Something that I learned, I took one of the classes just out of interest in psychology, and you
Yeah,
learn that like, over time the pain is there because it's trying to protect you. Um,
exactly.
yeah. And as much as I hate to say that as an athlete, like I think like you can't argue against, the biology like behind it.
100%, man.
Yeah.
So, I'm curious, how do you check in with your state of mental health, right? Like,
Mhm.
for example, what I've historically seen with the men in my life experience and myself at certain points as well, is it would kind of only be at that point where I've hit that wall, where I'm finally going through something that I have no choice but to take some form of action. Are you finding yourself to be a bit more proactive? Do you do check-ins with yourself? What do you look for, like when you do that kind of?
Yeah, I've always been kind of told, you can't wait until like for example, when you're taking care of a car, right? It's too late when the engine blows up.
Yeah,
You should try to, do regular maintenance on it.
for
The
sure.
best time to do it is when things are going well. So yeah, checking in regularly, not just when things are bad.
Mhm.
Because I've found that like, when you talk to your friends, if you only, reach out to them when things are bad, that might create like a different dynamic than if you reached out on a more regular basis.
Yeah,
So I've had the opportunity to kind of reflect, especially like you mentioned, finishing school. It's been a lot of reflecting to do.
hmm,
And yeah, my best piece of advice is just, check in on yourself. I'm someone who wants to be go, go, go all the time.
yeah,
But I'm learning a little bit more to, take this summer off, before I start work and, check in with how I'm doing the things that I want to do this summer. But yeah, I think like I said, that kind of hockey culture has always been, you need to keep going, keep going.
right.
Other people are going to outwork you if you take a break. So it's been it's been a mindset shift for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you've been doing wonderful work
Yeah.
with that, man. So
Yeah.
kudos to you.
Thanks.
You're
Thanks.
a living example
Mhm.
of, behaviors and just listening to ourselves and our body and, doing more of what we ultimately know is for our highest good, right? Sometimes we
Mhm.
just override that,
Yeah.
but, I'm curious for you, when you say that you check in with yourself,
Yeah.
right? And this is for education purposes, right?
Yeah.
I'd love to give our audience something useful
Mhm.
out of each conversation that we have, right?
Mhm.
So, to some, I remember when I was first, getting accustomed to what's the language we use when we talk about these types of things.
Yeah.
So when I would say, or when I would hear check in, I would be like, I don't understand what that means, So for you, what does checking in with yourself mean, and what does that look like in case some people
Mhm.
are trying to pick up a couple of these tools
Yeah.
so that they can start to implement them
Mhm.
for themselves?
Yeah. I'm a big fan of thought journaling. I learned that a while back when I was first going through a concussion. Like, I kind of have a scale of 0 to 10. 0 being like I'm in grave danger, and 10 being like I'm the best I've ever been in my life.
Wow.
Um, so that way you kind of have like a quantitative scale to see how you're doing. And you can kind of look back and see how it's done over time, and then maybe just like, a few things like, one thing you're grateful, or a few things you're grateful for, one thing you're worried about, things that are just on your mind. Those are things that I like doing. And but also like, I don't know if you're familiar with like the thoughts to feelings to behaviors. That kind of thing that's helped me a lot. Like, what are my thoughts? How does it make me feel? And then how am I acting?
Yeah.
That's kind of helped me, shape these thoughts and kind of hone in on how I'm feeling.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's really good, man. I find so much peace and release comes from when I pick up a pen or a pencil
Mm-hmm.
and get into a journal. Right? Like
Exactly.
sometimes
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know exactly what I'm gonna write, but I
Mm-hmm.
just literally make contact with that pen, let that be on the paper, and it's like, all right, soul, grab the wheel. What do you want? What do
Yeah.
you want to let out?
Yeah.
Right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's such a great experience for us to do that, right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious actually about okay, so I've noticed, for example, that a common thing that we ask people, even if we know that they aren't necessarily doing well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is, it'd be like quickly like, oh, hey, Nathan, you okay?
Yeah.
Right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I thought about like how I have responded to that question in the past. And, I found that because of a lot of the reasons that you mentioned already today, shame, fear, who am I kind of thing, I
Mm-hmm.
would actually, give that quick reflex response. Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah.
Right. But, I've noticed that people around me would do the same. And then it's like,
Yeah.
there's kind of this wall up because like, oh
Yeah.
shoot, I used my one opportunity to try to get in there. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
understand, emotionally, what are you feeling right now? So,
Yeah.
I'm curious, have you ever personally tried this out or been on the receiving end of someone asking you, how are you? Versus, are you okay? And does your response change if it's framed that way?
It's a tricky question. I've thought about this for sure. I guess it depends, on the relationship you have with the person.
Yeah.
Like if it's a close friend, then I'd be more willing to than if it was like my boss, for example.
Yeah.
Like I said, at work too, there might be that sense of like fear, telling your boss, hey, like I'm not doing well, right? Similar to like hockey kind of idea. But yeah, like I think when someone asks you, are you okay? Um, I think most of the time even when you ask that question, you're expecting to hear yes I am or yeah I'm
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think over time I've started to kind of want to hear what they have to say next instead of just thinking about the next thing I'm going to say.
Yeah.
I think I was talking to someone the other day about listening to understand, not to like not just thinking about the next thing that you're going to say back. So I don't know if it helps, but I'll say like, how are you doing? Like actually, and then I'll like pause.
Yeah.
Instead of just, saying like, how you doing? And then moving on to the next thing that I want to say.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed that it serves more as an invitation, because it can't just be that quick like, yeah, or yeah, you know what I mean? Like I think I've only heard someone actually answer no to me one time in my whole
Yeah.
life.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay, that can't possibly be true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So I found
Mm-hmm.
that with the how are you, at least it shakes them a little bit because like, oh shoot, I'm used to just saying yes or no.
Yeah.
Right. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like they have to think a little bit. And because you get those visual cues, you get to see the body language, you get to hear the tone, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I find gives us a little bit more of that insight of things that we can pick up on to assess, how is this person actually doing,
Mm-hmm.
despite what they're saying, right? It's
Yeah.
allowing us to really understand what, between the lines of what's not being said, so
Yeah.
I found that to be
Yeah.
really effective. And, in introducing that into my ecosystem, I find that when I'm on the receiving end of it, it kind of builds that sense of safety within that relationship, right? It
Mm-hmm.
helps me like, oh, you're not just trying to check the box of did I ask if they're okay?
Right.
It's like, no, like I actually want to know, like, are you good? Like, what's
Mm-hmm.
going on?
Yeah.
So I've noticed that one is helpful. So, for anyone who's listening to our conversation, I definitely encourage you to try that one out. If you're looking
Yeah.
to invite a bit more of that intimacy within your relationships, that might be a really good way to open that door,
Yeah.
to help us to really tap into the fact that we need to use a few different words and expand. And, it's safe for us to do that. We need to
Yeah.
prove more to
Mm-hmm.
one another that it's safe for
Yeah.
us to open up about these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, if I may add in, like, I think something that's kind of worked for me, and this works, for, I would say, closer friends. Maybe don't try this with your boss, but, asking specifically, like, it can range from like just general, how was your weekend, to a little bit more specific, like, how's your wife, how's your kids? Maybe like a little bit more specific so that, it makes them feel like, you care a little bit more about just how are you in general, because, anyone could say that. Maybe just, if it's a close friend, asking, how was the hockey game the other day? How was basketball game? Something just a little bit more specific, I feel like creates a little bit deeper of a connection.
I agree with you, man.
Yeah.
And you keep referencing the workplace. And
Yeah.
one thing I did in the workplace is I'm like, okay, I could show up as I do, everywhere else, or I could have a work identity, if you will, right? And
Mm-hmm.
time and place, you got to use your discernment there as well. But I've been in certain environments where I can actually open up and have more of those deep connections with the people I work with, right? So, to build on what you said there, I actually have gone so far at certain points when you work for big companies and stuff to actually, have a little journal and make some notes around, oh, so-and-so has a kid named this, and they used to play hockey, they used to go to this school, all those kind of things, so that when you're actually in those conversations, this is what stands out to people, right? When we're building these relationships to, whether it's for commerce or just for the simple, ability to connect with another human being, right? These are things that it's like, oh, wow, Nathan was really paying attention. He remembered that fact that I told him when I thought we were just gabbing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that really goes a long way and helps people to feel seen, which then ultimately builds that snowball for us to, enter into more intimate conversations and relationships, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I'm curious on how your definition of what a strong, complete man differs from what I believe a generation or two would have really relied on to define it. So,
Right.
when you think of it, what do you like, what comes to mind for you? How do you paint the picture of what a modern, strong, complete man looks like?
Right. Yeah, I've done a lot of thinking about this too. I feel like we're kind of the generation where it's kind of started to change a little bit. You know, you think about, you know, the man who is supposed to be the breadwinner, and, you know, doesn't have too much to do with the family. You know, I know a few families like that, and, you know, that's very traditional, I would say. But, you know, like, I think growing up for me, it's always been a little bit different because, my dad has always been the one who cooks, the one who does a lot of things in the house.
Okay.
So I've had a good role model that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think it's really changing where, you know, it's acceptable and almost encouraged to be, you know, vulnerable, like we said. You know, there is still that, I don't want to say expectation, but there's still that desire to be, you know, wealthy in terms of money, you know, have a lot of cars, have a nice house, you know, be in shape, all those things. I don't think that's necessarily changed. But it's more so like, you know, the emotional, the social capital that you have now. And I would say showing up for your family is more important now. I guess, yeah, like, you know, I kind of like the way, you know, it's heading, you know, where, you know, a lot of guys aren't just like drinking beers at the bar after, you know, I don't know if you watch like Family Guy where, you know, yeah, Peter's always, you know, at the bar, or same with like Homer Simpson.
Yeah.
You know, I guess that's kind of how I think of a traditional dad, but, you know, I've
Yeah.
been lucky to have a more, I guess, like modern type family.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's great, man. And
Yeah.
you know, it's so interesting because I like how you put that. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, you've gone to witness you know, your own dad, right, take on additional responsibilities that are building on what, you know, has traditionally looked like those male things that we ought to embody, right? So I find that as well. You know, what's really happening here is it's not leaving behind certain elements of ourselves. It's more just expanding what it means to be a complete human,
Mhm.
right? Like I find that the people who succeed the most within the world are the ones who understand that, yeah, sure, we can have these things that we label as male and, you know, feminine energy and all those kind of things. Those are all fantastic. But, you know, embodying one or the other doesn't make me that.
Right.
Right. And I find
Mhm.
that oftentimes men, you know, when we talk about, you know, us all having male and or masculine and feminine energy within us, when they hear that, it's like, oh, backs up. It's like they almost feel like that's
Yeah.
a personal attack, right? Like, no,
Yeah.
you only have male masculine energy within you. No, you don't,
Mhm.
right? And, you know, the people I see most successful are the ones who accept that they have both of those and they find a way to balance them, right? And they know when to let one lead versus the other,
Right.
right? So,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
with us, you know, us with your dad being in the kitchen,
Yeah.
right? Your dad is showing you he knows how to take care of himself and sustain
Yeah.
himself, give himself fuel for his body, right? You know,
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
often joke around in the brown culture, right? You know, like there's very strict expectations still, surprisingly, in certain areas around this is how it's supposed to be and you're supposed to be served by your wife and all these kind of things. So I sometimes would sit at the family gatherings and I would just watch and I'm just like,
Yeah.
are you guys really telling me right now that if your wife wasn't here you would just sit here and starve to death? Is that what would happen? Right? Like you guys know these skills. You guys can jump in there and you know you can learn how to do these things and these things are for you. You're not doing it
Yeah.
for somebody else, right? So
Mhm. Yeah.
I find that it's kind of an interesting conversation that, you know, the more we have of these, the more we can almost laugh at it,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Like I used to see Peter and Homer Simpson, like they used to, I find that they used to kind of be the typical depiction of what a lot of us felt like a male husband, dad, whatever did.
Yeah.
And now in these times, I find it so interesting because their attitudes and behaviors haven't changed. But now
Mhm.
I almost see that the continuation of them being those characters is almost like a spoof
Yeah.
of what reality is right now,
Yeah. Mhm.
right? So it's kind of
Yeah.
that like, oh, look in the mirror right now because this is so outrageous.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, do you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah. And I think something that, you know, I just thought about now is that, you know, when you ask, you know, what a man is, my first kind of thought was like how it relates to like, you know, having kids and having a wife, things like that. But, you know, like I think that's like an implicit bias that I have. So I just want to put that out there that, you know,
Yeah.
I just realized that, you know, that was the first thing I thought of when, you know, there's a lot more to being a man than, you know, having a wife, having a family.
100%. You
Yeah.
know, and you know, maybe just to share, you know, because I think this might be helpful for those who are listening in.
Yeah.
You know, the way I kind of used to look at it was similar to what you mentioned, man. Like I gotta have the high paying job. I gotta have more cars than I can drive at the same
Yeah.
time. I gotta have a big house that I'll never get to be in because I'm working so hard to sustain it.
Mhm.
You know, I've gotta look really wealthy, right?
Mhm.
Like that was it. I gotta make sure I get to the gym too somehow.
Yeah.
I'm still making time for that to look super jacked. right? Those are the things. But, as I've gotten to live and be a husband and, even before I became a husband, through going dating and you learn about yourself, right? I got to see that some of the strongest expressions of masculinity and safe, mindful masculine energy were actually a lot of the things that we were conditioned that are taboo,
Mm-hmm.
right? For me to actually know myself, for me to actually be able to connect with a feeling and be able to communicate, hey, Nathan, what you said to me actually really hurt me. It made me feel this way versus just saying, hey, Nathan, F you,
Yeah.
right? That
Yeah.
that is a strong man because he can
Mm-hmm.
communicate his feelings,
Yeah.
right? A
Mm-hmm.
man who can actually say, hey, in this moment right now, I actually need to go and just have a little time by myself to
Yeah.
process and decompress. That's not weakness. That's actually being a man as I've seen it now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being able to be calm in a stressful situation, right? Like, for example, I mentioned this recently. Living in Costa Rica, we kind of got this precarious, interesting mountain to go up to get to
Yeah.
where we're staying. And I actually got the car in a ditch.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was just like a 2-foot ditch,
Yeah.
nothing extravagant. But, my wife was a little bit shook up. And one thing that she expressed out loud was when she was sharing the story with other people was like, and Josh was calm,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? And I'm like, wow, okay. So like, a lot of these things that I think I hung my hat on in terms of, okay, make sure you embody this, make sure you embody that, so that you prove that you're this strong masculine presence. It's not that it's entirely wrong, but maybe those aren't the things that we always need to lead with. Maybe it's
Yeah.
far more expansive, you know?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
really what I've noticed in my lived experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious, what did you notice about you and your mental health as you were going through school, right? Like, did you
Mm-hmm.
find that you had adequate resources for you to actually, reach out to and connect with? Did you find that that was kind of lacking for you? What did you actually engage with as you were going through school to support you and your mental health?
Yeah, it was always definitely a worry, right? Living on your own for the first time, getting used to the lifestyle, getting used to, different style of learning, all the, drinking that happens after class.
Yeah.
So it was definitely pretty scary, but I felt like, Western specifically, set me up pretty well. They connected me with, the right supports, and, I feel like I had a pretty solid, friend group as well. So all in all, I felt like, it was adequate. There's always, better out there, but, they're always trying to improve it, I would say. But, I felt good about it.
Yeah. And something I'm curious about, because I've been seeing more research and things like this around this topic, but do you feel that as part of going through the educational experience of, the educational system and whatnot, much like we have a class that's dedicated to, say, sexual health,
Mhm.
right? Do you think that it's important for us to, moving forward, regardless of what type of educational space, people have put their kids into and whatnot, do you think that it's important for us to actually have some sort of mandatory class or credit tied to education around mental health and how to take care of yourself?
Yeah, I think so. I took, a few psychology class on the side just because it was, something I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And it's really helped me, be a better, whether it be employee, student, friend, son, friend, anything like that, right? Um, and same with like workplace training too. I think like you'll probably be a better employee if your head is in the game, as
Sure.
I would say. So yeah, I think there are certain things that I think everyone should know, because like I said, like although some people are more susceptible to it, I think it can affect anyone at different times,
Yeah.
and it really does hurt a lot of people, and it can hurt a lot of families too, right? That's the thing about it. It's not like a broken foot. It's not going to affect your family as much as mental health might, and affect your relationships and your family. So I think, it's important for everyone to be aware of it. And even, you might even be someone that someone reaches out to, for help, right? And I think that's one of the most difficult things, people do. And a lot of people don't know how to handle it. And I think people would benefit from a class like that.
Yeah. No, I
Hmm.
I agree. And, that was something that to me was a very big gap in, what we were sort of said as like the foundational curriculum for life, essentially, right? Like that's kind of how we framed the education system. So I found that that was a huge gap because I didn't know how to really connect with my feelings. For as expansive as my vocabulary is, it's really not until my late 20s, early 30s where I actually got to like truly connect with like all the inner turmoil and things that I needed to really address and release. And so, I can only imagine, especially now that, when I was going to PET, I'm sure it's an incredibly different vibe than when you were going to PET, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, just something I've noticed from a distance is obviously we're moving in a direction where people are more, they're siloed. We're
Yeah.
very self-contained units. So these opportunities for sort of organic engagement and passing by, say, the guidance office and noticing that, hey, they've got a counselor in today, for example, that might not necessarily be something that's in everyone's reality nowadays, right? We have to go out and intentionally seek it. So,
Right.
definitely trying to get people curious about it because it's something that we all deal with, right? And,
Mm-hmm.
in you creating safe spaces for people to have these conversations around their mental health and other things that they want to be vulnerable about. I'm curious what you've picked up on in terms of how do we, sometimes we notice that friend who they look like it looks like something's going on, but we don't necessarily want to be the one to like put it in their face and, all that stuff. So we kind of just gloss over it, or at least at a certain point, I was guilty of doing that. You
Mm-hmm.
know, would you have any advice for people who kind of want to step away from that and actually be a little bit more of the solution in the challenge? Not that they solve the problem for somebody, but how can we really open up that conversation with someone we're concerned about, just to let
Mm-hmm.
them know, hey, thinking about you, I noticed and I feel your energy. Is there any way that I can be of help here? Like, have you
Mm-hmm.
noticed any
Yeah.
any effective ways to go about doing that?
Yeah, this is always difficult, right? I would say, like, for a lot of my life, I've been someone who's been a little bit blind to how other people are feeling.
Yeah.
But lately, like, this concussion has honestly helped me a little bit to be better at reading people. But I would say, like I said before, listening to understand, not to be a solution. You want to validate how they're feeling and be there for them, but not necessarily say, oh, try this, and try to fix it in an instant, because that's probably not going to work. But also just, like, checking in often. Like I said, it's a little bit more weird if, you only, have a deep conversation with them when things are bad. But if you have like an ongoing relationship and conversation with them about things, it might be a little bit easier for them to approach a conversation. So I would say those are my two tips.
Yeah, awesome. I think
Yeah.
those are really good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, switching gears a little bit, I'm curious, so far in your life, right? And this can be from all sources, all spaces. What do you think the best piece of advice you've ever received was so far?
Best piece of advice. Ooh, um, I don't know. My first instinct is like, well, two similar kind of sayings, but they mean the same thing. One is like, if you flip a coin, when the coin is like flipping in the air, whatever side you want it to land on, then right?
Okay.
Like if you for example, like if you're trying to decide between two schools and you flip it and in the air you're like really hoping for one of them to land, then I think you've made up your mind. And like
Okay.
another thing is like, if you have your mind set on something, and then like something else comes along, and like then you wouldn't have preferred the second one if you really like the first one, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, okay.
Like yeah.
I like those.
So yeah, so those just mean to say that, like, like your heart is really going to tell you what you want, especially when you're making a tough decision.
Mhm.
That's how I've kind of felt it when it came to, like, picking a school, or picking between different jobs, or things like that. So that's the best piece of advice I've gotten.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
to build on that, I'm curious
Yeah.
if you have any kind of
Yeah.
guidance around this. When you
Yeah.
say that you listen to your heart, right?
Hmm.
I think that that's something that, a lot of us maybe need a little bit of work on, in terms of how do we actually listen to what our heart is trying to tell us. So, what have you found helps you to truly connect with what your desires are instead of maybe only being cerebral and, okay, let me be logical about what I want to do kind of thing? How do you allow yourself or give yourself that grace to really tap into your heart? Like, what guidance do you have around that?
Honestly, I'm a big daydreamer. So sometimes I'll just be thinking, like, like, what would the perfect day look like, or where do I want to be, 10 years from now,
Yeah.
and then kind of just take away any restrictions, because yeah, I tend to find that I deal with, like, logic and things better, so I challenge myself to just be unbound by reality. So yeah, I think honestly, just like sitting there and saying, you know, like, what do I wish I was doing? Or even when I'm going through like a job search right now, like I kind of say, you know, what would be like ideal number one, ideal number two, and kind of working through it that way.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks for
Yeah.
that tip.
Yeah.
Something that I find happens, especially for men, is that we often need, or we often feel we need, this sense of permission being given to us by other men for us to do something. Like, for
Hmm.
example, crying, right?
Yeah.
Chances are most men don't want to be the first to cry in a room of other men.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
But seeing one man do that might allow the rest of us to let those tears come up and then finally drop from us, right? So
Hmm.
I'm curious from you, what have you most needed to hear from a man or get permission, if you will, from another man for?
Yeah, honestly, the crying thing is something. Yeah, and honestly, like I said before, you know, even like playing volleyball after, you know, coming from hockey,
Yeah.
that was something that was, you know, hard to adjust to. Or like, you know, when it comes to like relationships and dating, like, you know, taking the time to, you know, process those emotions.
Mhm.
I think I have a lot of, you know, guy friends and, you know, you see them in the movies, the type to, you know, just move on, one
Yeah.
girl to the next girl to the next girl. So I think those are, you know, some things that I've, you know, kind of psyched myself through,
Yeah.
to kind of tell myself, hey, it's okay to like, you know, feel those things. Yeah, those are just a few examples.
Awesome. No, I
Yeah,
appreciate that, man. And
yeah,
yeah, I know that's an interesting one, right? Because it's like,
yeah,
well, if we haven't heard it, then are we really connected with what
yeah,
we need to
yeah.
hear, right? But
Hmm.
yeah, no, I think that's a big
Yeah,
one. And
yeah.
in us both doing what we're doing, right? What I
Hmm.
see a common thread through both of us is that we're really trying to show up intentionally every single day, right? No
Hmm.
matter what space we're in, we're really trying to allow difference to be considered,
Hmm.
right? And so I'm curious for you, do you have like a guiding principle for the way that you live every day? Like, do you have a legacy in mind that is like, okay, when it's all said and done, this is what I truly was shooting for. And, as long as I've done this with my life, this is what would truly be success to me. Have you thought about your legacy, like moving
Yeah,
forward? Because I know it's often something we think about
yeah.
kind of in retrospect on our deathbed.
Yeah, I mean, you know, through this, you know, high school network, it's always been about helping other people. You know, I was very fortunate to speak with some other alum who have, you know, gone on to the business school that I want to go to.
Yeah.
And that's one of the greatest gifts I've ever gotten, from someone else. So, you know, I'd love to, you know, continue that favor and, you know, help other people chase their dreams.
Yeah.
Um, that's something that I'm truly working towards, you know, whether it be, you know, in school and in jobs, you know, doing charitable work, um, things like that. Just someone who lifts up other people instead of, you know, tearing, you know, like, you know, I don't want to be a man who, you know, tears down other men, right? You want to
Yeah.
lift up other men and women too. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I actually,
Yeah.
yesterday I was communicating with someone, and what they shared is that, it was actually in one of the podcasts, and in the comment, someone was saying that we can actually help others rise as we rise, and I'm like, you
Hmm.
know what? That's a really, clear way for us to actually communicate that, right?
Yeah.
Like
Hmm.
we can all win, and when we help one another to win, that's actually how we all win that much more. So I think
Exactly.
that's a really noble cause and legacy to be in pursuit of, man. And
Hmm.
in my limited interaction with you so far, I can see that you're definitely on track for
Oh,
that.
oh,
So
thank you.
thank you for that.
Thank you.
Just to as we approach time here, to
Yeah.
wrap up, did you want to share with everyone, the best way to connect with you, why they might want to connect with you, and also I know you said that you're kind of in the job hunt right now.
Yeah.
So if you want to be so bold as to say what it is you're looking for, because that's how we find it,
Yeah.
right? What are you trying to get into? What space are you trying to
Yeah.
get into?
Yeah. So I worked last summer in investment banking, downtown. So in the finance field, worked for a French bank called Credit Agricole. They cover all the pension plans, that are based in Canada, especially the ones in Toronto, as well as Brookfield, which is an asset manager, and other Canadian banks. So that's something I'm actively pursuing. You know, you can find me on Instagram or through this account or LinkedIn. But yeah, those are the best ways to reach me.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, man, I think we've gotten a lot out of this
Yeah.
conversation, and I saw we had a lot of people jump in. So I think that, whether they caught it live or they're going to catch the recording when we post that, I think everyone's going to see themselves in this conversation. I think there's going to be a lot of really key takeaways. So I
Okay.
really, really appreciate your time and the way you show up. And I really hope that you take this time this summer to celebrate you and all the milestones you've had, man. You so
Okay.
deserve this
Okay.
rest and time to enjoy.
Okay. Thanks so much, Josh. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Alrighty. Well,
Okay.
everyone, thank you for tuning in. We really appreciate you taking this time out of your busy day to give us an hour to tune in. These conversations are just as much for us as they are for you. So please let us know in the comments if there's anything that you want us to expand on, any questions that you had that came up after you finished watching. We're both here so that we can answer that and, get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you once again. And until next time, everyone, take care.
Okay. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
Okay.